When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Beliefs expressed on the following program by the host, guests, or callers are not necessarily the opinions of FantasyAccess.com, Media Group Inc. Ownership Management sponsors the website. Time for an hour of hardcore hoops with a Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro. There's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Let's get to the show basketball fans crave. Let's get inside the paint.
Good Friday morning, everybody. Time for Inside the Paint. Clay Ferraro here, Ira Winderman there. Ira, how's your Friday going so far, my man?
So far, so good. I'm enjoying a little bit of the downtime with the Heat. Looking forward to some huge college football this weekend. Disappointed in my U.S. men's national soccer team last night. Stayed up to watch no goals scored. But you know what, Clay? With the Heat adding Marcus Garrett yesterday, you could see they are churning up again. We are now less than 4 weeks away from the start of training camp. So it's getting real even from a basketball perspective.
And see, I stayed up late last night watching UCF, which means that they're going to claim another national championship for making us stay up late.
They've already secured the late night championship. They moved past Leno and Conan O'Brien, and they're right up there with the current host. So yeah, they'll claim something for sure.
Which, by the way, when you say that there's a lot of big college football games coming up this weekend, of course you're talking about my Virginia Tech Hokies taking on North Carolina tonight. Like, I know that's the game that you've had circled on your calendar.
But you know what, Clay? All kidding aside, you have a lot of fans on your side tonight because they know how the ACC is going to shake out. Yeah. And they know that if North Carolina gets an early season conference loss, that completely changes the outlook. As weird as it is, it might even be more important for North Carolina to lose this weekend for than for to win to where they want to get, which just shows you how conference plays into this so much. But college football, another story for another hour for the Big O Show.
Yeah, 100%. And well, nobody comes to us for college football. But look, I am the farthest from like your egotistical, like cocky alma mater fan. I think Virginia Tech wins tonight. So I'm just throwing it out. I think they got a lot more going. So, but you mentioned Marcus Garrett. We got a lot of stuff to talk about with the Heat. I want to talk a little bit about what he's going to bring to the table for the Heat a little bit later on in the hour of the show. We just saw, the Eastern Conference just gets tougher and tougher. And it's not like Paul Millsap is, changing the Nets from being, good to, a championship. But he does add an extra element. They're probably going to sign LaMarcus Aldridge. So I want to talk about the news of the week, how it plays into the Eastern Conference and pertains to the Heat. I want to talk about the luxury tax a bit because I know that's Heat fans' favorite topic. And by favorite, I mean least favorite. But I want to start here. We're a Miami Heat show. We make absolutely no apologies about that. And yet what we're seeing going on in Philadelphia right now, I think is just something that right now, since it's kind of a slow time when it comes to transactions in the world of the NBA, we're still in that lull period before training camp tips off. This is the thing that Heat fans are talking about. And what an absolute disaster the situation is in Philadelphia. And we've talked about this the last few weeks and kind of in the context of, all right, where does Philadelphia stand? Where do the Heat stand compared to the rest of the Eastern Conference? But this week, Ira, it feels like we're coming to a head with things in Philadelphia where this thing is no longer sustainable. And everything we've been talking about, the hierarchy of the Eastern Conference, Philadelphia is the least stable team among those teams towards the top. How do you see this thing playing out?
Yeah, and that's the thing. As we go through Inside the Paint, brought to you by Pallet Rack City, and we talk about it from a Heat perspective, this is a Heat story. I had an Ask Ira question this week at sunsentinel.com, and I wrote a headline about, will the Ben Simmons scenario impact the Heat? It will. People took that the wrong way. I'm not saying the Heat are trading for him. You and I have discussed the pluses and minuses there. One, the Heat have nothing to offer, which sort of ends it right there when you start with. You have the Jimmy Butler, Ben Simmons relationship or non-relationship, when they played almost a full season together in Philadelphia. And Clay, honestly, the factor of bringing in another non-shooter to a team where you already have Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler in your starting lineup, it would be tough to make it work. Plus, you've already gotten Kyle Lowry as your dominant ball handler. So what I was trying to show to people was, even if the Heat are not involved in a transaction, if you consider yourself a contender, if you consider the top of the Eastern Conference your landing spot, it impacts you hugely for this reason. Like you said, we'll talk about the Nets and their roster bolstering. We know and have to respect the Bucks as the defending Eastern Conference champion. But where does the Heat fit in after that? Are they number 3? Are they number 4? Are they number 5? And what Philadelphia does with Ben Simmons will largely determine the Heat's ability to possibly finish number 3. When you go through these permutations, if, and I don't think this is happening, they make a deal for Damian Lillard. I got to tell you, Clay, if you're asking me, okay, which is a better big two, Joel Embiid and Damian Lillard, or Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler, with all due respect to the Miami Heat, I'm going with that Philadelphia duo. Now, you could argue maybe Kyle Lowry supplants Tobias Harris as the number 3 guy, but it changes the dynamic. If they make a trade for C.J. McCollum and add shooting, that changes the dynamic. The one thing I'm really interested in is Philadelphia, and it's interesting, we're segueing from Omar Kelly's spot with Big O talking about Deshaun Watson, and all the Texans are asking, if Philadelphia really is asking for a similar package, something like 3 first-round picks, well, Clay, here's my question. They just signed Joel Embiid to an extension. So why would they wind up then going for draft choices and playing toward the future? So I think Philadelphia's decision with Ben Simmons hugely impacts the rest of the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, and the only reason why you do that is if you're expecting to flip those picks for another star. And you mentioned it, Damian Lillard. And there's so much to unpack with this thing as it pertains to the Miami Heat. I want to start, though, with let's go back. And one of my favorite lines, one of my favorite back and forths from any movie is Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson in White Men Can't Jump. And they were talking about Jimi Hendrix. And Wesley Snipes was listening to Jimi Hendrix. And he goes, Woody goes, oh, you listen to Jimmy? He goes, no, I don't listen to Jimmy. I hear Jimmy. He's like, yeah, that's what I said. You listen to, no, you don't understand. You listen to Jimmy. I hear Jimmy. Jimmy Butler and his relationship with Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid is something that we've kind of like seen as like this periphery story over the last few months, ever since Jimmy Butler came to Miami, leaving Philadelphia. And it was kind of, I think, portrayed in some circles as another example of Jimmy Butler being difficult, another example of Jimmy Butler being a clubhouse problem, a locker room problem. And what I think is we've seen over these last couple of years is, look, at some point, it's the player's fault who always is in the middle of a problem.
Sure.
And yet, when you look back in the situation in Minnesota, which was completely dysfunctional, you look back in Chicago and what happened there with Butler and the coaches. You look back at what happened now in Philadelphia and what's left behind. Now you're starting to look at this and say, maybe Jimmy Butler was right. And I know Heat fans have said this forever. Obviously, you're going to side with your guy. And yet, this is something where we know Jimmy Butler and Joel Embiid have an established relationship. Mm-hmm. You're reading reports this week about the fact that this whole Ben Simmons thing, it's not just Ben Simmons. Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons apparently can't play together anymore. So, like, at some point, if you're a Heat fan, like, not that Heat fans have any problem saying, I told you so, but they can say, I told you so. And I think this is something that if you're a Heat fan, like, and you go back and there's this, we talked last week, right, about who is the Heat's rival anymore. And we kind of, glanced off Philadelphia because they're not in the same division. They haven't played in the playoffs other than that one year. But I do think there's this process versus culture thing. I'm sorry, Ira, but score one for the culture, given the last 36, 48 hours of what we've seen. And this is not me as somebody doing a Heat show, like trying to pander to a Heat audience.
Right.
Like at some point you have to look at this and say, what you have in your organization matters. And Philadelphia right now, for everything they did to get some really talented players in the building, it is an abject disaster of a situation right there. And I don't know how they get out of it, especially if they're asking for the world for Ben Simmons, who at this point, his contract is an extremely devalued asset.
Well, but it's interesting. You can look at it two ways. Or you can look at it, it's a valuable asset because he's locked into a contract. So in other words, he is being linked to Minnesota potentially, possibly to Cleveland, possibly to Toronto. Those are places that want players under contract. Remember, when Jimmy got traded from Minnesota to Philadelphia, he was on an expiring deal. There was a risk.
Players aren't going to go there, basically.
Right. Like, so what they're saying is, even though Ben is owed the big money for a non-shooter, at least you know when you acquire Ben Simmons, unless he pulls this act again, you have him for another 3 or 4 years. You don't have to worry about that expiring contract. To places that don't get free agents, that might be more important than the player himself. But Clay, you're right. When you go back and do the Jimmy Butler scorecard, look, we know that he can be difficult. He has been difficult with us at times.
Sure.
It's who he is. He can be persnickety. He can be moody. But let's do the Jimmy Butler scorecard, okay? He gets into it with Fred Hoiberg with the Bulls. When has Fred Hoiberg last been seen? He was ushered out of the league. He gets into it with his teammate and the situation in Minnesota. Where have the Timberwolves been ever since? I could tell you where they've been. They've been in the lottery. He goes to Philadelphia. Yes, Kawhi hits that shot, and they're eliminated in a dramatic end of regulation in a Game 7. But Philadelphia really ever since has not been the same team either. So when you do this Jimmy Butler scorecard of petulant Jimmy and troubling Jimmy, and you go back and you look at all these places where there are issues, all of a sudden, like you said, do you look at the player or do you look at the situation there? There are certain places that certain players can only play. And sort of the Pat Riley school for wayward basketball players has worked out over the years of bringing guys in, letting them be themselves. Eric Spoelstra, a coach who never puts himself in the forefront. This is not the coach first kind of team under Eric Spoelstra. His players are the team. He takes a back seat, prefers not to do media, so you can see what's going on. In Philadelphia right now, they have to get something done before the start of the season. You were even mentioning if they get first-round picks, they could possibly flip them for a veteran, get that third player. But that's hate to use this word, that's a process. That's going to take time. That's going to set them back a little bit also. I have no idea what to make of the Philadelphia 76ers. I have had a hard time from the get-go sort of buying into Philadelphia is number 3 in the East, and then we move down. I'm not so sure that's the case anymore.
I agree.
I'm not so sure that Boston isn't up there. The Heat aren't up there. Atlanta isn't up there. And we might be watching a team, a process imploding in front of our very eyes. And you know what? I got a feeling over at 601, Biscayne Boulevard, they're fine with that as well.
Can I speculate? Can I throw out another reason why they may be okay with this?
Sure.
And file this under rumor, file this under chatter. This is not sourced information, so this is not me reporting it. But what I have heard, and maybe you've heard similar, and this is, again, not coming from inside the Heat organization, but just from talking to people, that if you picked one player out there that Pat Riley could find a way to get in that building at 601 Biscayne, and this is like beyond your Kevin Durant, beyond like your MVP, although maybe this guy could potentially be an MVP candidate, it would be Joel Embiid. That there has been we hear a lot about Bradley Beal, but if there were some point, they don't have any means to do it anytime soon, unless Philadelphia all of a sudden wanted Kyle Lowry's contract and you trim this thing. But that Joel Embiid has been the one. It's a combination of being an incredibly skilled big man. Yes, there's the injury history, but I do think that the fact that there is that relationship with Jimmy Butler there. So add that to the list of reasons why everybody in that building at 601 Biscayne may be chuckling a little bit today.
Well, and then let's take that to its logical conclusion, because if you're going to add a Joel Embiid, if they do blow it up in Philadelphia, if Joel Embiid forces his way out, the player going the other way, and I know this is something we could do a whole hour show on, and it comes down to this. Would you trade Bam Adebayo? So because that would have to be the deal, Clay.
Absolutely, yes.
You'd have to send me back. Yes. And of course, and I don't know if you're mocking me for mentioning that.
No, it's because we've had the conversation before.
Or for saying that you, of course, talent-wise, no offense to Bam Adebayo, Joel Embiid's on a completely different level as a two-way player. So you could say to yourself, you know what? We could see a trade like that, but the Philadelphia 76ers would have to blow it totally up. Daryl Morey, just like he left Houston, would have to leave Philadelphia. Doc Rivers ain't going anywhere for rebuilding. Remember, Clay, how he left the Celtics. He left the Celtics when Danny Ainge said, we're going to retool a little bit. And he's like, no, I just won a championship. I'm not going through that. He went off to the Clippers. So again, are we seeing the implosion of the Philadelphia 76ers? Are we seeing them, sort of the oil and water with Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid? And are we seeing this whole process, as I've spoken to Big O about, that for everything they did, the only last man standing from the process is Joel Embiid? It's really interesting. And you deal with this, and I know you talk with Will Manso on Local 10 on Sundays about this. Whenever people talk about the Heat rebuilding or starting over again, please look at what happened in Philadelphia and say to yourselves, do you want to live that reality for one long shot chance at a conference finals and everything else being so uncertain? That's why you don't rebuild. That's why you don't tank. That's why you don't count on the lottery. Philadelphia, what they're going through now, can wind up with nothing tangible out of what they celebrated, the process.
And I think the thing, if you go back to keep this from in a Miami Heat light, I think the reason why the 1 year that they did quote unquote tank was because Pat Riley loves stars and he viewed Derrick Rose as a star. Whereas I think the difference between them and Philadelphia is it's not like in advance Philadelphia was like, man, we're going to tank because we really want Joel Embiid. We're going to tank because we really want Ben Simmons. It was, no, we're going to tank because we want a bunch of draft picks and we want the opportunity to potentially get a guy. It's like it's like a higher end version, although maybe not so much higher, of what we're seeing in Oklahoma City with Sam Presti, only they got a bunch of draft picks. It's right. Like, we're going to get the best players that we can. So bringing it back to the Heat, it's, you want to keep this, I hate to use the word culture and over and over again because it feels kind of lazy, but it is. You want to keep that winning culture alive.
And Kyle Lowry said that this week when he was interviewed by CJ McCollum on CJ McCollum's podcast. He said, I wanted in Miami because they play for championships. Because he knew now in Toronto they might have to take a step back a little bit after losing Kawhi and Serge Ibaka in recent years. And he said, no, I want to go to a place where they play for championships. That's why Goran Dragic sort of balked to going to Toronto, because he knows they might be reloading. Unlike if he gets forwarded to Dallas, they're playing to win. Players want to live in the moment because you know what? Tanking and everything else is about someone else's moment. They don't give a rat's butt about 4 or 5 years down the road. They want to live now. Their time is now. The Heat's time is now. The Nets' time is now. The Sixers' time? Not so sure anymore.
And here's a perfect example of this, by the way. It's, look, the Milwaukee Bucks last year, I think a lot of people viewed this. Look, you want to capitalize Giannis's window, and you feel like, hey, they had to make a move in order to keep him happy. But I don't remember anybody saying when they traded for Drew Holiday, oh, wow, that was absolutely the right move to give up every draft pick that you have between now and the year 2050 in order to get Drew Holiday. It was somewhat of I don't want to say a desperation move. I love Drew Holiday, but they felt they had to make that move to make sure that they were competitive. Then you get to the playoffs and something happens. Kyrie Irving gets hurt. James Harden has the hamstring. So it's a combination of what you just said. You want to make sure that you are keeping that winning culture there. You want to make sure that that's the perception around the league, but also you want to get there because you never know what can happen. And that's where the Heat are right now. There is one thing that Ira Heat fans have kind of been a little bit frustrated about over the years. There's one word. It is, as Pat Riley calls it, the tax. Ooh. And I want to get into that next. Is that keeping the Heat from potentially being a championship contender? That's coming up next, right here on Inside the Paint.
You're listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a good rack? Pallet Rack City. Sports fans love a place with great food, cold drinks, and TVs everywhere. That's why sports fans love Sports Grill and their 7 amazing locations. Check out the Bird Road location at 11481 Southwest 40th Street in the back corner of the West Bird Shopping Center. Sports Grill is also now offering some great employment opportunities. All kinds of positions are now available from kitchen to hosting. Call for more information at 305-485-8845. From wraps to salads to amazingly delicious specialty dishes, Sports Grill is the home to the legendary special grilled wings. Since 1987, Sports Grill, good food, good drink, and good friends.
This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
There's no need to drive around South Florida wasting valuable time looking for a new or certified pre-owned Acura. Go to the #1 volume sales dealership in the Southeast United States. Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. Purchase with pace and space in a dealership tailored to your needs. From home buying to providing that personal touch. Contact the 2020 Satisfaction Award winner Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. 888-776-5123. That's 888-776-5123. Or visit them at 15601 Pines Boulevard in Pembroke Pines.
When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. If it's hardcore hoops you desire, make sure you subscribe to the Big O Radio Show and never miss an episode of Inside the Paint. Let's get back to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro.
Welcome back to Inside the Paint. Clay Ferraro here, Ira Winderman there. We spent the first segment of the program hammering the Philadelphia 76ers, so if you're a Heat fan, you wouldn't want to be anywhere else for the first segment of this show. I want to move on now to, this is a topic that I think there is something of a misconception out there about the luxury tax. And Ira, you hit on this a little bit last week. You said somebody asked you about it in the Ask Ira column as well. So I want to dive into this a little bit. And I think the question is, and let's just get it out there, is the refusal, if you want to put it that way, to go into the luxury tax, is that keeping the Miami Heat from going from, as you call them, a challenger to a contender? If they were willing to pay that, would that put them up in that next tier?
You know, it's interesting because it's sort of the opposite of that as far as the way the Heat discuss it is if they believe they are a contender, they're willing to spend into the tax. So in a lot of ways, when the Heat get to the line, and right now, folks, they're at the line, they cannot add a single contract, even for the NBA minimum, and not be a tax-paying team, at least at the moment, for the 2021-22 NBA season. So the way Pat Riley's put this before, the way Mickey Arison has put this before, if we are a contender or a championship contender, we will spend into the tax. So this year, they've drawn that line at the moment. There are a bunch of sort of ancillary factors here. If you get into the tax 3 years in any 4-year period, you pay a much larger tax going forward. That's what the Brooklyn Nets are going to be paying now. That's what the Golden State Warriors are going to pay. We know the Nets are a championship contender. The Warriors believe with Klay Thompson coming back, they can at least be there, contend with the Lakers in the Western Conference. So I'm not sure the Heat look at themselves, honestly, right now as championship contenders. Again, they can go into the tax at a certain point if they're like, whoa, we're 20 games over 500. Then look who's behind us in the standings. It's the Brooklyn Nets. Yeah, then I think come the trading deadline, come the buyout deadline, the Heat are going to go, okay, we're pushing our chips all in. I think right now they're sort of sitting on the sidelines. And the reason for this is not, I hate when people go, Mickey Arison is not willing to spend. Mickey Arison has done nothing but spend. You can even argue has spent in some of the wrong places. Again, this is the person who green-lighted the contracts for Tyler Johnson, James Johnson, Dion Waiters. He's green-lit all this stuff. He's the final voice on all this. Nick Arison, his son, who runs the Heat's operation. So they've been willing to do that. So it's just a question of where do they think they stand right now. So it's not a matter of being cheap. It's a matter of being fiscally prudent. So in 2 or 3 years, if they believe they're contenders, when Bam grows as a player, when Duncan Robinson grows as a player, and they have to make moves, instead of signing a player for 4 or 5 times his value against the tax, it won't be that severe. But I think it really is interesting as far as where they think they stand right now, that at least for the moment, line in the sand, 14 players, including Udonis Haslem. They have one of their two-way players now under contract, Marcus Garrett. We'll get to him later in the show. They have room for one more, and that's it, as other teams continue to add players, whether it's Rondo, whether it's Millsap. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you have to sort of sit back and wonder, it's 601 Biscayne. You put the lie detector on everyone, okay? Everyone's strapped in now. Pat Riley, are the Miami Heat a championship contender this year? Andy Ellisberg, same question. Eric Spoelstra, same question. Nick Arison, same question. Adam Simon, same question. Clay, I'd be really interested to see what the lie detector tells me about those answers.
And so I think a lot of this started with the Mike Miller deal, and maybe even before then. But I feel like that kind of set things in motion to where, look, they amnesty Mike Miller, and then all of a sudden it's like, they're being cheap. And look, I think in hindsight, if you asked them to do it over again, they wouldn't have amnestied Mike Miller. I mean, maybe that's a different conversation, but I feel like ever since then they've been kind of paying the price. Some might argue that they deserve to pay the price, given that it may have been one of the straws that broke the camel's back with LeBron leaving, although that's a different discussion. I think the thing that I find interesting about this is you're right. I would say when we mentioned Joel Embiid, and look, I'm not going to do the salary cap gymnastics to figure out how this would have to happen, whatever. Plus, you're talking about a sign and trade now with Kyle Lowry to where you're hard capped, and that would play into it. But hypothetically, if the Heat were able to acquire someone like that, and again, realistically, not saying it, but like somebody like a Joel Embiid, bringing in a Joel Embiid, you mean to tell me that if they would get Joel Embiid, that Mickey Harrison wouldn't greenlight the tax? Of course he would. I mean, those are the types of moves that I think they would be perfectly willing to. But if you're asking me if they're willing to go into the tax to sign a Paul Millsap, the answer is no.
Right. And so it's the degree, because, again, that would make you a championship contender, the kind of move you said. Who knows? Maybe even a Damian Lillard trade if the price would be right. Although now with Kyle Lowry, that fit seems to have changed when we were first speculating something like that. The Mike Miller thing is interesting. LeBron felt that some of the chemistry the team has lost, it led to that miserable 2013-2014 season when they ultimately lost to the San Antonio Spurs there at the end. There is a financial prudence to all of this. Yes, Miami spends like the most major of major market teams, but they are not. Whether it's their local television deal, whether it's the sponsorships, you're just not a New York. You're not a Chicago. You're not in LA. You don't have a Staples Center. You're in a little different situation. So I understand all that. There still are moves that he can make. They still can add another player later in the season and still stay under the tax line also. But Clay, I think the Heat are really going to let this season sort of breathe and see where they wind up. And maybe all of a sudden the Bucks become like the post-championship Heat in some of those years where they're not the same team, where they've sort of exhaled a little bit and they'll have a little bit better sense of where they are. I am concerned. We've discussed this before on Inside the Paint, Pallet Rack City show every week about the Heat's depth, that they have only a certain amount of veteran depth, that they come off the bench with Markieff Morris and with Dwayne Dedmon and Tyler Hero. And after that, it's a little bit questionable. If everyone stays healthy, if there's no COVID, I don't think it's a problem. But there is COVID, and there are older players who don't stay healthy. So that's where it's interesting. So you have a Lakers team. They go out, they get a Rajon Rondo. Is he the ultimate difference maker? Heck, I don't even know if he's going to play. He didn't play for the Clippers during the playoffs. The Nets go out and get a Paul Millsap. Clay, let's face it. If Paul Millsap had a market, he would not have been waited to have been signed on September 1st to September 2nd. So let's have some perspective. There's some other names out there who could wind up getting signed also, whether it's a J.J. Redick or some other veteran players, Wesley Matthews. There always will be a name to augment if you need to. But you have to sort of play the financial game also. The tax is real. The salary cap is real. Your exception money is real, whether to spend it now or to hold it till the trading deadline. I do question the Heat's depth because of the older roster, because of COVID. Even yesterday, we got the COVID rules. Even if you're vaccinated, but you test positive for COVID, you could miss 10 days. We all remember the impact last season when Jimmy Butler missed 10 games
100%.
Because of NBA protocols. To me, that completely changed the season. I know that changed their place in the standings and that changed their seeding. So, yeah, I think there's a real fine line. There's a real tightrope they're walking over not bringing in a 15th man to avoid having to pay the luxury tax. But as part of the machinations of running a team, more than Mickey Harrison saying, well, if I bring in a minimum guy, that's going to cost me, instead of $1.7 million, it could cost me up to $4 million. I don't think that's the thinking. I think this is more long-term. Yeah,
it's going to cost me 3 cruises instead of 30. Like that's not how he's looking at it. So look, let's just make this real simple for you guys.
Sure.
Okay. You don't go into the tax to sign Paul Millsap. You do go into the tax to bring in a Joel Embiid, a Damian Lillard, a Kevin Durant, like
Bradley Beal, right?
Right. Like, we're not being realistic here. What we're saying is those are the types of moves. And to put a bow on this thing, Ira, depending on where you look, Sportrack has 10 teams that are paying the luxury tax or have a tax bill due, but Hoops Hype has 7, and these are the 7 teams: the Warriors, who, by the way, I think are one of the more intriguing teams in the NBA. And there's a reason why they felt like they had to pay that. I want to see what those big three can do with Wiseman. The Warriors, the Nets, the Clippers, the Bucks, the Jazz, the Lakers, and the 76ers. Every single one of those teams, you have multiple max players, yes. Right? And so I think, and look, obviously the Heat do as well with Butler and Bam Adebayo, and you're paying Kyle Lowry a lot of money. But all 7 of those teams are up there in that contender status, other than the 76ers, which are kind of falling off. The Jazz, you can say what you want, but they were up there as the top 2 seeds in the West last year. So the Heat are not at that point where they're going into the regular season as prohibitive favorite type teams in the conference, or if 1 or 2 things go right. But you would go into the tax to put yourself in the conversation with the Nets, with the Bucks, with the Lakers. So there's the distinction there. So Clay, I understand the question.
And there's another factor here. The Heat will get to the tax. Believe me. Think about the contracts they signed in the last year or so.
Yes.
That you signed Jimmy Butler, who now, for the next 5 years, is at $220 million. You signed Bam Adebayo, it is $183 million, $163 million. You signed Kyle Lowry, it is $85 million. You signed Duncan Robinson, it is $90 million. Eventually, when all those keep having their increases and their multiplier effects, their percentage increase, you're going to have to be the luxury tax, simply because all those guys are going to be $20 million plus players. So you have to plan for a rainy day. You have to say, do we start the repeater clock now when we don't have to? Or do we accept the reality we have to be in the luxury tax once Bam is fully collecting and Duncan is collecting and Jimmy's extension kicks in and Kyle Lowry kicks in? That's when you spend your full mid-level. That's when you go out and you take in more in a trade than you send out, because you're there anyway. You're waiting. It's really interesting, Clay. The Heat is an old team, yet its biggest money is still down the road, even with this oldest roster. So they're going to have to bring in some fresh legs because, Kyle Lowry's 35 going on 36. PJ Tucker's an older player. Jimmy Butler's going to be 36 at the end of his contract right now, at the end of the extension. So they're going to have to plan for that rainy day anyway. People don't want to talk repeater tax. People don't want to talk luxury tax. People only want to talk wins and losses, and I understand it. And if this was baseball and there was no salary cap, God bless the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Padres lately and what they're bringing in. You can do that. But there were rules here. There were rules why the Dolphins can't do certain things, why the Heat can't do certain things, why the Panthers can't. These are salary cap leagues. I know we didn't get into sports because we wanted to be accountants or bookkeepers, but unfortunately, like you just went to Spotrac, you have to account for all the salaries also. That's why this luxury tax is sort of an uneasy thing with the Heat, but a very real thing with the Heat.
Yeah. And look, the bottom line here is that there's a reason why I guess they lost the benefit of the doubt. But I think if you and it's the Mike Miller deal, but if you kind of dig into it a little bit, you figure out why they're there. So you mentioned the need for depth, and you also mentioned Marcus Garrett. What are they getting in Marcus Garrett, Ira? And what are you hearing about the potential for him to be one of those players, not just in the future, because we know that the Heat love to get these guys, especially on two-way deals, that they can transform into players who are significant contributors down the line. But what are you hearing about the ability for Garrett to come in and immediately at least kind of replace, if you get to that rainy day scenario this year where you're losing guys because of COVID? Is he somebody who can come in and potentially give you some minutes?
A couple of things about the two-way rules, and they've changed the last 3 seasons because of COVID. It used to be you were very limited, like 50 days in the NBA, let alone games or on the roster. This season, last season, you can play as many as you want. This season, you can be on the active roster for up to 50 games of the 82-game regular season. So you can be around a lot. We saw last year the impact of COVID, whether it was Gabe Vincent or Max Strus. They played a lot. They contributed. With an older roster, I think you could see that happening again. Sort of the continuum of where you're saying, where does Marcus Garrett fall? Low end, Briante Weber. High end, Patrick Beverley. So you're talking about a journeyman who, honestly, Clay, stuck around the NBA for 5 seasons in bits and pieces in Briante Weber. I think played for half the league on 10-day contracts. Not the worst outcome from a player who went undrafted. Or a guy like Patrick Beverley, who's been a major component, complementary component on some pretty good teams also. So I think he has a chance. I think right now, if you were to sick him on ball on just about any NBA guard, he would harass that player at least into fatigue, if not exhaustion. But could I have him out for extended stretches on a team without an outside shot with Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo? Probably not. So a nice developmental process, started the process in Summer League, 4 strong games, 2 in Sacramento, 2 in Las Vegas. I think even though they said he was ill then, they were sort of hiding him. They didn't want anyone else to poach him. We've seen DeJon Jarreau was poached from the Heat earlier this offseason on a 2-way contract. So think by the Indiana Pacers. So things like that can happen. You know what? A nice story. And Clay, I want to sort of wrap this up this way. Remember on draft, ahead of the draft, Pat Riley said, we don't have a draft choice, but we will get 2 players out of this draft. We, of course, all shook our head like, yeah, you don't have a draft choice. Well, one of those players is Marcus Garrett. There's still another 2-way contract available. I think they're going to bring Javonte Smart from LSU in here. I think Micah Potter from Wisconsin is going to come in on Exhibit 10 contracts that let them go to the G League. I think Pat Riley's going to get his 2 players out of a draft that he didn't have a draft pick in. So I think we learned better than to doubt him. Marcus Garrett's a really good start. Again, the story I wrote before the draft was, how will the Heat get number 61 in the draft, the first undrafted player? I think when we look at this offseason and after the season and we say, okay, Ira, forget everyone who was drafted. Those teams had draft capital. Who did the best after the draft? I think Marcus Garrett might put the Heat in position to say we did among the best after the draft.
That's really interesting. All right, so we talked a lot about the guys who are on this team, but one thing that we kept mentioning was the potential for attrition as the season goes along and why you need that depth. And look, it's the cloud that's kind of hanging over and will continue to hang over. It is COVID-19. And we've seen some stuff in the NFL right now where vaccination status, Urban Meyer comes out and flatly says this does play into this. So I want to talk about the new NBA vaccination rule. As much as I think this is an uncomfortable topic, I think it's one that we have to hit on as we move on to the season, how it pertains to the Heat and how it could potentially affect them as the season goes on. We'll hit on that and more. Plus, we're going to get some of your chat questions. We got some great ones coming up next on Inside the Paint.
You're listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a good rack? Pallet Rack City. Sports fans love a place with great food, cold drinks, and TVs everywhere. That's why sports fans love Sports Grill and their 7 amazing locations. Check out the Bird Road location at 11481 Southwest 40th Street in the back corner of the West Bird Shopping Center. Sports Grill is also now offering some great employment opportunities. All kinds of positions are now available from kitchen to hosting. Call for more information at 305-485-8845. From wraps to salads to amazingly delicious specialty dishes, Sports Grill is the home to the legendary special grilled wings. Since 1987, Sports Grill, good food, good drink, and good friends.
This is the Big O Show. 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 This is the Big O Show.
There's no need to drive around South Florida wasting valuable time looking for a new or certified pre-owned Acura. Go to the #1 volume sales dealership in the Southeast United States. Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. Purchase with pace and space in a dealership tailored to your needs. From home buying to providing that personal touch. Contact the 2020 Satisfaction Award winner Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. 888-776-5123. That's 888-776-5123. Or visit them at 15601 Pines Boulevard in Pembroke Pines.
When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. If it's hardcore hoops you desire, make sure you subscribe to the Big O Radio Show and never miss an episode of Inside the Paint. Let's get back to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro.
Let's take you behind the curtain really quickly. I texted Ira during the break because the first couple times we did the show, randomly my internet would come out like exactly 50 minutes into the show. And so last week I cut it off, cut it back on, and it worked out fine. This week I'm trying because we upgraded the internet to see if it works. So I texted Ira. I said, hey, just FYI, I'm going to try to go through this without signing off and signing on to see if it works. Ira responds, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll just start singing.
As usual, Clay doesn't know what goes on when he goes away. When the Clay is away, the kids will play.
So what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to intentionally sign off just so we have to hear Ira singing to give you guys some extra entertainment.
Broadway hits.
If you're just joining the program, we spent the entire first segment hammering the Philadelphia 76ers because we know that's something that Heat fans like to do. Then last segment, we got into the tax a little bit. And just the fact that I think there is kind of this perception out there that maybe started with the Mike Miller situation that I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it, that Mickey Arison is cheap and doesn't want to pay the luxury tax. But the reality is that there are more things involved there. And when you look around the league at the teams who are paying the tax, you can kind of see the distinction there. So if you want to get back, you want to listen to this again, Ira does a good job of breaking that down. I want to hit on COVID-19 in this last segment and how it's going to impact not just the Heat, but the entire NBA. We're seeing it impact the NFL because Urban Meyer says it is impacting the NFL. He says it factored into their decision. I've heard some people say that Urban Meyer was just saying what a lot of people are thinking. We saw the rules, it was either yesterday or the day before, of the NBA kind of making it very clear that the league is going to look a lot different for players who are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. So Ira, kind of break down what these rules are, how it pertains to the league as a whole, and also how it's going to impact the Heat and what they may do as the season goes on.
First, Clay, I think we need to clarify. I think it's been portrayed in a lot of circles incorrectly that the league is adding punitive measures to those non-vaccinated. It's actually the opposite. They are freeing those who are vaccinated. Right. And the key point here is no mandatory testing. If you're asymptomatic, if you're around someone who tested positive, then yes. Otherwise, none of this showing up to the arena once or twice a day, constant testing, never knowing if you're going to play or not. If you are vaccinated, you go on with your life. If there is reason to suspect you might be contagious, just like with the flu or a stomach flu when they send you home, they will send you home. They will test you. So it's the opposite of how it's been portrayed in some circles. They are not penalizing the unvaccinated. They are simply freeing the vaccinated. And they are doing so in a way that now you don't have to schedule your day around testing, that you can arrive on the second night of a back-to-back, not have to get up after arriving at 4 a.m. at 8 a.m. and take your COVID test, that you can just get on with your day as if it was 2 seasons ago and none of this ever happened, hopefully staying out of trouble. You can commingle with your other teammates. You can go outside. You can deal with outsiders. You're basically as free as the rest of us are. Yes, you still have to be mindful if you have a cold or feel somebody's coming on, just like you always had to. You have to be decent. But the rules for unvaccinated players now include proximity. You can't be within 6 feet of other players who are vaccinated to run the risk. What this means basically is you're going to be, I know it's a tough word to use here, but segregated. In the locker room, you won't have the preferred locker stall. Honestly, last year, some guys were dressing in the shower room. There wasn't enough spaced out lockers. Now they're bringing them back in the normal locker room, except for the unvaccinated. So Clay, if you walk in the locker room this season, you might not see player X's locker because it's somewhere else, maybe in a closet. On the team plane, basically all players get the equivalent of first-class seating, the way these NBA planes are set up. The rest of them, including the coaches, basically sit in a more typical coach type of setting. Now, when the players get on the plane, Joe non-vaccinated goes to the back of the plane. He doesn't get his first-class seat. He can't be around his teammates because of these rules. So you could say on one hand, I know what the NBA is doing. They're making this whole thing so intolerable to players, untenable to players, that they're going to get vaccinated. Well, yeah. They're trying to make it equal for everyone. They don't want to penalize those who are vaccinated. So it's going to create a change. I can tell you this, Clay. At the end of last season, every Heat player was vaccinated. But as you know, they've redone the roster so much this offseason, added so many new players, including guys who are going to be trying out, the two-way guys and like that we'll have to see how it shakes out. It'll be very visible. You'll see in practice when you and I hopefully go upstairs to the practice court, we'll see certain players after practice with masks on. Well, no non-vaccinated. Everyone else can just treat it like it was 2 years ago. So again, not punitive, really the opposite. They're sort of freeing players who've decided to get vaccinated.
So what does this mean for teammates who may be vaccinated then? So like, let's say you have one player who is unvaccinated and either he tests positive or, is symptomatic or whatever. Players who have come into contact with that unvaccinated player who then tests positive. How does that impact the vaccinated players on the roster?
There still will be contact tracing, but if they're vaccinated, they'll be much quicker to return than the non-vaccinated players. So again, they're in a much better shape. There won't be that 10-day mandatory requirement. There will be a test. There still will be testing. Matter of fact, they're also testing players before the start of camp to see where their antibodies are. That if they got vaccinated so early in the process, we know the booster thing is coming around, whether they need a booster. In all the mandatories, including the mandatories for referees, they said you have to not only be vaccinated, but also potentially any other booster situations also. So I think, Clay, that you will see players during the course of the season be subjected to either get your booster also whenever that time comes for players who are eligible in that group, or else you fall back to category 1. COVID is still with us. It's still going to impact this season. A player who tests positive still will miss significant time. And as you know, Clay, you could be fully vaccinated and still test positive for COVID. So you could miss time. So depth will matter, and it will be a season still unlike any other. Clay, I can't believe it. I really thought, okay, 2019-20, you go to the bubble, the season ends in March, you're fine. Okay, last year you need a full run with mostly a regular season, 72 down from 82, but we're getting there. We're not there yet. This will be another, I don't want to say asterisk season, but this will be another atypical season, just like it is for everyone in society.
So getting to some of the questions here, too extreme. This goes back a couple of segments. Wow, Joel Embiid for Bam. I'd make that quick trade in a heartbeat. Look, I think if everybody's being honest, that's probably going to be the response from a lot of people. Let's see.
And I got to tell you, you know what? I sorry to interrupt you there, but we were talking about what you might or might not trade for Ben Simmons, for example. But at least the Heat would have a chip in that deal, and that's not the worst deal for Philadelphia. If Joel Embiid starts going off, they could do a lot worse than a young Bam Adebayo under a full extension, plus another valuable Heat chip, possibly a Duncan Robinson or something like that. I'm not saying that's happened, and I think we're all putting way too many words into Joel Embiid's mouth. Remember, Clay, he came out this week on Twitter, and he said, don't put me in the middle of this whole Ben Simmons thing. You know, USA Today had a story on this, and he said, this is not a me and Ben thing. This is Ben and management here and something like that. So, but at least in that situation, the Heat would have something to put in play. It's interesting. Going back to when we started doing this Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint, we talked about who you'd put Bam into play with. Remember, we talked about Bradley Beal. We talked about Damian Lillard, and we were a little cautious because you have such a unique player. And I know we were mocked in the chat group there a little. This would be a little different. But yeah, right. And let's face it, Clay, if this goes to crap, and I'm not saying it will, but if it does, the Heat, they'll be open to trading anyone and everyone if they have to, because they want to get this right, because Pat Riley still wants to be in championship contention at least one more time.
Cap for life, what's going on, my man? Good to hear from you. And then this was a good one I wanted to get to. How did I lose this? Man, this is live streaming at its best. How did I miss this? All right, well, here's one right here. Sure. Too extreme again. I'm not trying to get ahead of time, but if both players, and Joel Embiid, Bradley Beal, were both available, which of the two would you want the Heat to go after, and why? I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer, and I love Bradley Beal, but it's Joel Embiid. He is a generational, transcendent type big man talent. So for me, it's Embiid. And
he's more unique at his position than a Bradley Beal, who's a very nice player, or even a Damian Lillard, who's an older player now in his 30s. So you have to think about that also. So, yeah, it's really interesting. I think if Joel Embiid gets caught up too much in the middle of all this conjecture, he's going to go, hey, I lived through the process. I was patient there. I'm not putting up with this BS anymore. It's really interesting. Daryl Morey, for whatever reason, couldn't hold on to James Harden in Houston? Are we seeing that all over again? And again, we're not a 76ers show, but this all impacts the Heat. It's just, will there be one more hurdle or one fewer hurdle?
And let me add one more to this. And again, I really like Bradley Beal. He's a phenomenal scorer. Bradley Beal is also a horrendous defensive player. And maybe he gets to, if he were to get to Miami, he'd be better. But Joel Embiid's a good defensive player. I mean, a really good defensive player.
He's Defensive Player of the Year award contender and an all-defensive team guy. Absolutely.
Right. So there's a lot of reasons why. Here's one that I was trying to find. Tremolio, how does, and he was talking about the 6 feet rule amongst unvaccinated players. He says, how does that make sense when you're within 6 feet of the players on the court? And this is, and again, Naira, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is in many ways about risk mitigation.
Yes.
That, it's unavoidable for them to be within 6 feet of each other on the court. And you're running up and down, you're doing a lot of that. But you don't want to add to that by then having them within 6 feet of each other if they're unvaccinated, where the air is kind of like settling down and things like that. So, and that was my read on it.
Yeah, and that's, again, that's the contact tracing. There's X amount of time. If you remember when the Heat played those 2 games of Philadelphia last season, they were down to 8 players. They were almost at 7 because the league literally was doing the math with Tyler Hero as far as how much actual minutes and seconds was he next to player X. Does he qualify as being contact traced and away from the team and the games are postponed? Is he available? And do the Heat play with 8? Same thing here. You're simply trying to limit that. Look, Clay, I have a lot of issues with a lot of this. And one thing from a personal perspective, and this will impact you also and Will and the people in Local 10, is this. If the locker rooms are closed and they're going to use it under the guise of, hey, we want to limit contact, so we don't want the media coming in and mingling with the players, I'm going to have an issue. If you're vaccinated, I'm vaccinated. I don't know I'm not talking about anyone's status, but if the media people are vaccinated, I would find it hard to believe we can't commingle with the players in the locker room, but these guys can go in public to restaurants, to movie theaters, to supermarkets, to malls, not knowing if people are vaccinated or not. When I covered Summer League, I had to send the front and backs of my vaccination card to the NBA, had to fill out a questionnaire, certify that everything was true, and then hand it over to them. So it's just a matter of, it seems kind of, two-sided to say, well, no, we're limiting the media or anyone else away from them if you know they're vaccinated, but the player, they can go and spend the rest of the afternoon at the mall if he wants.
And I'm just going to be happy when we're not having to talk about this anymore. But it is the reality. And I understand, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to us right now are.
And what do you know? We hit about the 15-minute mark here, and I guess we learned the lesson that Clay Ferraro's internet at home is paid on an hourly basis. So while Clay reconnects, just again to go over the rules here when it comes to the NBA vaccination policy, these are all works in progress. That right now when the NBA is discussing their vaccination policy, they even told us these are the rules as of now. But in mid-September, we'll have further rules. Does it impact the way the games are played? The hope is not. Does it impact the schedule? No. We're talking still an 82-game schedule, not the 72 games of last season, not the fewer when the NBA went to the bubble there. So we have that in play also. A regular season, regular rules, closer to regular rosters, except two-way players now can be on rosters for 50 games as opposed to previous rules when they could only be around the team or practice for 50 days. So the NBA knows this in between. And just like in previous season, the NBA has said there could be modifications. We might have to expand rosters, make other players available if it comes to that. But the hope is here from the NBA, with the high vaccination rates that they have right now, that when it comes to all these rules, that the NBA basically will be in a better place otherwise. And please, because if Clay might not watch the replay here, don't tell him the song selection that we went through there.
I am so disappointed.
And if he wants to hear Barry Manilow's greatest hits, he's going to have to go somewhere else.
Apologies. Oh, that's it. I finally figured out it is not the internet. It is something with the device, whatever. So now we know next time I will disconnect.
Turn the screensaver off.
I really apologize to the viewers and the listeners because I was able to get back on quickly and I did not hear a single tune from you. I did not hear Barry Manilow.
But I also did, in all honesty, went through the NBA rules a little bit more about what's going on with COVID. Okay. And just the fact, Clay, and you're dealing with it when you report on other sports also, is how we know that everything could change at a moment's notice.
Yes, but again, as I was saying before we got cut off, we're all ready to talk strictly about sports, yes. But this is the reality that we're dealing with. So even though it's an uncomfortable subject, felt like we had to broach it. Last one before we get out of here.
Sure.
We were asked, is Tyler Hero a showcase player this year? In other words, in some ways, are they maybe going to put him in situations, not just to help himself and the team, but also to show off what he can do, to where if they decide that they need that extra player, that they're going to put him in a situation where he makes himself attractive as a potential trade option?
Before the end of training camp, or really the start of the season, the Heat will have to guarantee the next season on Tyler Hero's contract. It's an automatic on a rookie scale. But a year from now, Tyler Hero will be eligible for an extension, the same type of extension as Bam Adebayo received last November. So the Heat have decisions to make. Is he another guy? Clay, we talked about this earlier in the show. The money they're paying Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry and Duncan Robinson and Bam Adebayo, how many of those can you have? And you have to decide, should Tyler Hero be one of those? So I think they will explore everything about Tyler Hero to see what he could be in this roster. But your point is a valid point, as is the person on the text line there, and that is, and the chat line there, and that is this. He's also probably their best trade chip. They don't have a lot of mid-tier contracts. They don't have a lot they can deal. Anyone signed in the offseason cannot be traded till at least December 15th. Certain players like Duncan Robinson, not till January 15th. So if a deal comes along, if it's a Beal, if it's a Lillard, if it's a Simmons or whatever, Tyler Hero is still going to be the showcase piece through no fault of his own, because he's their most tradable asset right now. So to a degree, he's already proven himself as a tradable asset. Now you have to ask yourself, is he an extendable asset? That's what I think this season will be about.
So much to talk about as we get ready for camp coming up at the end of the month. Guys, thanks for spending some time with us today. Thank you for letting us steal some of your Football Friday away. The Big O Show rolls on next. I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more about the Canes, the Dolphins, and the national champs from UCF. I had to get it in there. Hokies going to beat the Tar Heels tonight. Guys, thanks for hanging out. Big O Show rolls on next.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro, exclusively on the Big O Radio Show. Search Big O Radio Show on most platforms. Subscribe and smash the like button to support Inside the Paint. If you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business, there's only one choice: Pallet Rack City.